one with
Nice.
Mr. Robert Charles, who, pull it up on my phone, author of Eagles and Evergreens. The story, come on, focus. It'll be in the description and the top comment. It will be the thumbnail. Mr. Charles, who grew up in Maine. It's a lot of vignettes of what it's like it's a unique take on things, because instead of just here are World War II heroes and their stories, it's one thing I've always pointed to about like why I thought America boomed after 45. And it's granted, the main reason being we're the only superpower, like that's a given. But I always thought, like, I think there had to have something to do with these men coming back from being slaughtered on the beaches in the South Pacific and in the European theaters. My take on it always is when you come back to America, building a Fortune 500 company probably feels like a walk in the park, right? And that was my mindset, was like, and that's what led into like the boom of like the 50s, the 60s, and then raising the baby boomer generation and kind of distilling down to my generation. But that's kind of an opinion I've held for years, is like, aside from the geopolitical balance, obviously super complex, but I've always thought that, and your book is the first to go into, not necessarily or excluded to the heroic stories of what they did, but kind of what it's like to grow up around them. And yeah, for everyone listening, give them a real quick introduction to yourself. You've been on here before, but for all the new listeners.
No, I'm grateful for it, and so I'm one of the lucky Americans. We're all luckier, I think, and have a lot more to be grateful for than we often think about, even in these times that are uncertain. And I was lucky because I grew up in a small town, as you so perfectly described, under the influence of these World War II vets and also some Korean War vets who greatly valued all of those rights that are in the Bill of Rights, but they also, obviously they valued them. They had gone away and fought for them. But they also came back and they valued them, I would say, twice as much when they returned. Yeah. And they did a number of things on their return that we so easily forget, and yet we should not forget, because they really are timeless. The way that they operated on coming back is sort of an inspiration to us now that we can pick up that mantle and carry forward. So just a short this is the book itself, Eagles and Evergreens. And, it was written in 2018. It's a great volume if you're having a hard time falling asleep, but it's
nonsense.
It's a great volume, really, because it's about positive stories that describe two things, as you so well said. One is profiles of vets who did really what they didn't think were very extraordinary things, but what I, on reflection, thought were really extraordinary things. And then on the flip side, it is the flow down, I like that phrase, the flow down of their values and their commitment to a small town, which then infused all of us growing up around them with certain key attributes. One is that you don't give up easily. Another is that hard work, good work is good for the soul, and you're lucky to have work. Yeah. And you should rise to that challenge. Some of them ended up being farmers. Some of them were contractors who built houses. And I can go through stories because they're really extraordinary little stories that turn into life-changing stories for a lot of us. But they also had an enormous respect for this country at its heart. And I think that, in many ways, is what makes the book timely here in 2020. Like Ronald Reagan, many of them lived through a situation where those values were put to the test personally with them, and as a society, Western values were confronted directly, both by communism and by fascism, and they rose at every turn to confront those that would take those rights away. And I think that's really an important lesson for us right now. So just to take you sort of through the book in a more leisurely way. Just a few stories, and I guess they don't come in the particular order that in the book. They come in an order that sort of cross references things I'm doing in life together with things they're doing. But some of these guys were just unbelievable. One guy that is central in the book is a guy named Richard Lincoln. Mm-hmm. So here's a guy that stands maybe 5'5", 5'6". He's the youngest of four brothers, and one of his brothers, Tink Lincoln, will spend the rest of his life being the postmaster in town, 40 years. Incidentally, the same amount of time that his father was the postmaster in town, to show you how small this little town in Maine is. So there are four brothers. Rich goes away. He knows nothing about war. There's some pictures in the book of him as a child and a young man, and you can tell, just from the way he holds himself, he knows nothing about fighting a war. Yeah. And he ends up in a number of places. He first ends up in North Africa, but the real stories relate to him in Italy. Somehow, the designator that he ends up with is as a first scout. So as a first scout, he's with the 188th Infantry Division, which happens to see a lot of action. He's over there for more than a year. He's put in the south and comes north through a number of battles, including Cassino, ends up peripherally at Anzio turns the age of 19 when they rescue Rome on into Florence. But the key thing is he was a first scout. So his chances of living, if you read the history books, not only about the 188th, but which they called the Blue Devils, because the Germans said they fought like devils and they happened to have a blue patch on their shoulders. So they became known as the Blue Devils. But they were unique for a number of reasons. First of all, they were a draftee division. So that was one of the very first draftee divisions they put in. They didn't know if they could fight. It turns out they could fight very well. They liberated Rome on June 4th, 1944. Pause there for just a moment, because June 4th, of course, is 2 days before
D-Day.
D-Day, June
Operation
6th.
Overlord, yeah.
And I have to believe, the three big capitals, of course, were Rome, Berlin, and Tokyo that we were fighting against. It had to have bucked up at least the officer corps, if not everyone, 2 days before they'd go in to Normandy, knowing that they've taken Rome. Yeah. So, again, an extraordinary personal story, because he has lots of small stories that relate to this time of service. But the bigger story is, as a first scout, his job every night is to crawl to the front lines and to put up these small flares that are green, and then they come down as little parachute. And they light up German positions so that our artillery can hit them. Of course, they also light up the first scouts
position. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, Richie, if you can believe this, I talked with him in his 90s. I knew him all his life, and all my life, really not all his life. But he never talked about that experience ever in his all those years. He had a couple little stories he would tell that were sort of what I'll call toss-off stories. Getting caught in a under a road, hiding from the Germans at one point. Little stories, but it turns out that when he got into his 90s. I think it was cathartic. We were just talking, and I asked him about his youth, and all of a sudden this stuff starts pouring out. And in many ways, he was the inspiration for writing a lot of this, because it reminded me, or for the first time taught me, that these people that I spent all my time around, these veterans, actually had a lot to say that they had not said. And in many ways, it was to save us. People say, well, they didn't talk about it because they didn't. They couldn't bear to talk about it. Actually, it's not true. I think the reason they didn't talk about it was twofold. One, if you've gone through a horrific experience, maybe you were in an automobile accident or something, right? You don't get together with everybody and talk about the automobile accident. Yeah. It's not in the way you think about things. So the second part of it was, I think they really meant to protect their families and those young people like me around town. There was no sense that those memories and the things that had happened to them absolutely burdened them. He had night sweats. He had, but there was no sense, as he told me, in sharing those events with his wife or kids, because it would only burden them. Yeah. And so that's the first lesson I took away. The second was that these guys were far more heroic than they gave themselves credit for. And I say heroic because I think I can afford to say that. Sure. I look at them objectively. This guy every night did that. And every day, a first scout, one of their jobs was to come to the front of the line, maybe 25 yards ahead, and rifles up to be able to hold and get at the machine gun nests, which were putting the rest of the unit at risk, or the company at risk. And so that was their job in the day. And then by night, they crawled to the front lines. And he said, as he recounts in the book, you ran as fast as you could run. You hid behind pebbles, rocks, trees. There were shots around you all the time. Incredibly, over that course of time, although he had the Bronze Star and some other awards, he was never hit, which is stunning. He was out there every night, and but he attributes it to being only 5'5" or 6, and so he felt that he had a special option there.
Yeah.
Kind of got away. Others, so he was just someone that was in town that I knew well. And again, a town of 500 people, you know everybody well. You see him in the general store. You see him everywhere. And then it came to those that taught me, which were literally teachers. One of those teachers was a guy who had 6 kids, and he ended up with he taught English, and he had been on the beaches of Normandy on the first day, promoted to captain on the beach, worked with generals like Taylor and Timberlake, ended up being one of the officers, and he was an officer who ended up after they got inland was sent on a recon mission. There were 3 officers sent in different directions for a recon mission middle of the war, because before Bastogne, if you've seen Band of Brothers, the battle that occurred there, the Battle of the Bulge, before that, there were general officers who said, and there were a number of men who said, something is not right. The Germans are back on their heels, but they keep probing our lines, and they're probing in different places. Why are they doing that? And so he was sent. Doug Stevenson was sent out in a Jeep in one direction. 2 officers were sent in a different direction. And it turned out, as he described it on film to one of his grandchildren, that he came over a rise and saw just a phalanx of Tiger tanks. And so they began, and of course he then returned with that intelligence. He ended up winning the Silver Star, and I think the Croix de Guerre with a Silver Star, which is the highest division level award in France. But very heroic, but never talked about it. In fact, did not talk about it with his family, didn't talk about it with anyone until toward the very end of his life. Interestingly, his wife, who lived to 103, I think, Priscilla, her brother, the entire Band of Brothers series was built around really a winner of the Distinguished Service Cross. Her brother, Joseph Ford Berry, won the Distinguished Service Cross in Sicily. He died in Sicily, but one of the things that he did, which was really remarkable, is when they were in a retreat environment and German tanks were coming in large numbers, he, and the citation is clear, and there were those who were eyewitnesses there, he ran across an open field to get the last remaining anti-tank weapon, and he turned it on those tanks, which caused, of course, the tanks to turn on him, which allowed his company to get away. And he stayed with that until they killed him. So he was really heroic in the most remarkable, I think, honest sense of that word. And then there were others in the town. Another English teacher, who again did not think that he'd done anything special, was at Iwo Jima. He said, I was in the 2nd or 3rd wave, so, somehow that didn't count for him. And he was also at Okinawa, and, he educated me in a lot of ways. First of all, he was an English teacher, but there were 2 things about him that step out in the book that are really quite remarkable. One is that he had what the chapter on him is called depth perception, because back in the days before they had really a good way to target, they would use viewfinders that, in a sense, required someone with a really, really good eyesight to identify out how far the target was so that they could then align the big guns. That was particularly true on the battleships, and he trained on one of the battleships, even though he later ended up in a smaller ship. But so the bottom line was he could look out, 1,500, 1,600, 1,700 yards, maybe a mile, in rough distance, and make a very educated guess as to exactly how far that was out. So in his 90s, and I think I talked with him at 92, he's still alive. His name is Lincoln Ladd. I said, sir, how did you do that? And he said, well, first of all, it was a lucky thing for me that I had that. I didn't know I had it. I got into training. They separated me and one other person out because of our eyesight, and the rest of that unit actually went to a ship that got sunk, and most of them died. So he said that was a lucky first step. He said, I'd like to think that my eyesight saved me that time. But he said, it's just something that I was born with, and I didn't really know I had. And he then rose to levels of responsibility in the in the Navy. He actually was started out not being an officer, came back, got his college degree later, actually even studied for a PhD. But in that time frame, this eyesight was really a significant asset for the Allies. So sitting with him in his 90s, I said to him, "So can you still do this?" And he said, "Yes, I can." And I said, "Can you give me, I don't know, an example?"
Yeah.
So he looked across the room, and I had given him a little pen, maybe something like this. And it was sitting 15 feet away. And he said, "Well, that pen was made in China." And I said, how do you know that? And he said, "Well, if you look at it, you'll see that on one side, so you got a pen that's about this size, and it had a little clip on it. And on one side of the clip, it said made in, and on the other side, it said China." And he said, I'd given these pens away for years. I never saw that. It was ingrained in the metal.
Jesus.
I went over, I picked up the pen, I looked at it, I said, "You can still do it. That's extraordinary." I never knew that about him either. Interestingly, most of these guys did not know things about each other.
Yeah.
And that is another piece that's really significant. There were other veterans in town who did extraordinary things, and there were Korean War veterans who are also written up in the book that did extraordinary things. And so the epiphany, my first sort of 3 or 4 epiphanies, my first one was, this is incredible. Multiple Civil Star winners, multiple Bronze Star winners, a Distinguished Service Cross winner, all in a little town of 570 people in rural Maine. How could I not have known this for starters? And then knowing it now, how remarkable, how miraculous that the one town in the world that had all these special people in it, I was in. And then I began to think about it again, and I realized, well, first of all, these guys in all of these towns all over the country don't talk about it, nor in cities. They did not talk about it much, whether they were in aviation or anything else, infantry or anything. They didn't talk about it. And then I began to realize, no, this town is unique, but it's not the only town like this.
Yeah.
There are towns like this all over the state of Maine.
Yeah.
And then it sort of swept me, no. There are towns like this, neighborhoods in cities like this, with these really special heroes all over the United States. And I started going to veterans' homes and talking to more of them and coming to the conclusion that this is one of the most prized, wonderful blessings we have in our midst, that we live in a generation, a time when these guys were still alive, and they
are
and some
still
of them
alive.
still are. Yeah. And that also goes by the way, I would say, for the heroic nature of the Korean War vets and of course the Vietnam War vets as well. You know, one of my history teachers, a story that isn't in this book but will be in the next book, it's coming, is a story about a Vietnam vet who was my history teacher. And his name is Dave Cook. He lives not in this town, but in the town that's just next door. And when he was in high school, he wanted to be a history teacher, even back in high school. And he had read a lot of the classics back then. And the Vietnam War came along, and unlike most people, he volunteered. And he stepped up, not with a Yahoo attitude, but more with a, well, this is what it's about. You know, when the calling comes, that's what I have to do my part to be equal to my time. And so he went over there. He's in the 101st Airborne Division. Every opportunity that he had to get to the front lines, he was on the front lines. And 2 stories just rung out with extraordinary impact on me. The first was that his unit, which was heavily hit in a number of cases, and he tells stories about just surviving by some miracle, which is the same way Richie Lincoln described surviving, the same way a lot of these guys described surviving. It was a miracle that they got home. He says that on the last day of his tour over there, where he again had volunteered to the front lines, he and another guy were taking a hill, and the names are all there, but and a grenade came over the top of the hill and landed between them. Yeah. And they sort of had a moment of looking at each other, and he picked it up and threw it, and it went off. But, you know, he said it could have been the end right there on the last day of my tour. The second story that really struck me was the level of camaraderie, the willingness to risk your life for the guy beside you. the willingness, not only for your country, and they all did love their country. There's not a one of those vets that thought they were special, but there's not a one of them that didn't love their country and put their life right on the front for their country. But when he got back, he felt that there was not a resource for these Vietnam vets in his unit to a way for them to communicate with each other. And so by the time they were all back, the ones that did come home, there were several thousand in his named unit. And so he started a newsletter. Now, there wasn't a computer, there weren't computers, there wasn't email. He started a newsletter, and he has run it ever since for that particular group of Vietnam vets. And I asked him, so tell me, what do you think that did for you? What did it do for them? And he said, well, let me just tell you a couple simple little stories. And the one that stuck with me most sort of profoundly was, he said, I got a call from a guy at one point who said, I'm looking for a vet named John. And so Dave Cook said, well, John who? He said, I don't know, just John. And so a story unfolded around this veteran named John, who this other veteran was looking for. And the story goes like this. They were in the middle of a firefight, a very difficult firefight. And again, the names are all laid out. And this particular vet, was coming across an open field and found a medic with 4 guys on the ground beside him. He was working on 3 of them, and the 4th one he had put to the side and was not working on. And so the guy that had stumbled onto the medic and the 4 badly injured other vets said, why is this guy why nothing for him? He said, he's completely bled out. He's gone. And he said, I've got to save the 3 that I can save. And so he looked at the fourth American veteran there, and he said, what do you mean he's bled out? He said, he's completely white. There are no veins. He's gone. So his heart was still working. And so this guy that had stumbled on the medic said, so if I can find a vein, can you get plasma in him? He said, you find a vein, I'll put plasma in him, but there are no veins to find. And so he looked, and eventually he found a vein, a very small vein in his ankle. And so the medic did turn and put plasma in him. And as my old teacher, Dave Cook, said, got him going again. And now, 30 years later, the guy who recovered and shouldn't have was looking for the guy that had saved him. The only thing he knew was his name was John. And Dave put the 2 of them together.
Jesus.
So these guys have stories to tell that make life deep. They cause us to stop and think about what's worth doing and what's not. Cause us to think about why it's worth speaking up for rights in the Bill of Rights that are under pressure now, right now, whether it's free speech or freedom of worship or self-defense or and I think one of the most beautiful things about this book, again, Eagles and Evergreens, the reason that it got so well reviewed, and the reason, and by the way, from everyone from, it got endorsements from, Bill Cohen, former Secretary of Defense.
Oh, it's got stuff. I have a lot of authors on here. For everyone listening, this isn't just another author I'm having on. This book has been highly endorsed, and it's fantastic. It will be in the description in the top comment. It's good.
And the beautiful part about it is that if you read these stories, you appreciate America.
Yes.
You appreciate these men. But then the flow down is that a lot of these stories are things that were sort of tales of adventure, tales of getting out of scrapes that the kids growing up around them sort of took from them. And so the beautiful part is that to me, it's a celebration of America. Yeah. And I think that if we care about the future and we care about what is expected of us now, it doesn't just mean as veterans, only about 7% of the country are veterans, but it does mean that we appreciate what has happened around us and before us, then we should be studying the past.
Yes.
And one of the things I would recommend to every teacher, it makes a great teaching volume. There's nothing profane in it. There's nothing you shouldn't.
It's as clean as you can get. It's as clean as you can get.
Almost.
It's as PG as you can get for a book about World War II veterans. It's about as clean as you can get.
That's right. But the piece that I think it reminds us is that these men and women, and there were women too over there, taught us a lot about what it means to live life, both in terms of the sacrifices they stood up for and made over there, but on their return here, what it means to be self-contained, what it means to be self-disciplined, what it means to be self-reliant, what it means to help others. And I would recommend, simple recommendation for teachers, whether it's high school level or college level or beyond, is take a look at a book like this, maybe not this one, but take a look at this book if you have a chance and see if it doesn't have stories that you could use in your classroom. And then the second big piece of it is, and I've always believed we should be doing this and we don't, I did teach for a little while. I think you should take a class through a military cemetery. It doesn't have to be Arlington, but walk through those gravestones with, in your mind's eye, the stories of where, by the dates on those stones and by the places where these men served, and think for a little bit about what they handed on to you. They handed on to you the gift, in many cases, of their own lives, and they expect you to do something with that gift. They expect you to step up for it and then to pass it on in as good a shape or better to the generation that comes after you. And so that's part of what this book was for, was to remember the good news stories out there and to pass that good news forward. I think that you are doing a great service by taking your microphone and bringing to it those who do appreciate those values. And I will also add that I think that it's interesting, as you get older, I think you find that people come back around to core truths.
Absolutely.
Because their life teaches them those truths. You don't have to teach them. Their life teaches them. And so, some of my friends that were all for, more government, have come around as they've gotten older to saying, I'm a little tired of all these taxes being paid for things that I don't want done. Maybe lower taxes make sense. Maybe a sense of commitment to these core values in our Bill of Rights makes sense. And I think what you will find, I suspect, over time is that people will gravitate to you if you keep your show headed in this direction, because I don't think the timeless sort of, we talked a little about natural law the last time. I don't think most of these timeless values change at all, generation to generation. It's just we who change.
Thousands
it's just
of years.
Deep in and bad information. And 1,000 years from now, kids born in that time frame will still have a longing for free speech,
for natural law.
And all those things. And so I think our job is to keep them alive. I'm reminded of Edmund Burke, who obviously was not American, but he was a Britisher who supported our revolution, which is quite interesting in its own right. But he said all it takes for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. And he was very aware that we have an intergenerational obligation. That crosscuts everything.
That's exactly what it is. And I found that in my short life. I'm 30 years old. I grew up super conservative, super right wing, to getting older and being like, screw this, it needs to all be love and beauty, and going through that for several years, and then kind of coming around from 18 to 26, after going militant, far left hippie, to kind of coming around to be like, that didn't work. They had good intentions, but hey, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I've kind of come back around to 22-year-old me would look at me and be like, screw that square. Hair's combed over, he's in front of an American flag. And now I'm just like, hey, you know what? I implemented all these things back into my life a couple of years ago, and I'm happier than I have been in a decade. And I think
there's nothing that makes you sleep better than gratitude.
Absolutely.
If you can help others and be grateful for what they've done for you, you go to sleep content, in the sense that you know what your bearing is. You know what the compass rose, where you're headed. And I say Reagan, but here's a guy who, gosh, go back and read his speeches, or listen to his speeches. Listen to the one at the Berlin Wall, or listen to the one, and I know you've done this, But listen to the one at Normandy celebrating the 40th. You know, it's
peace through strength.
He got it spot on.
Oh yeah, his peace through strength speeches. Those give me goosebumps. Those are. And then, hey, you don't even need to choose a Republican, because here we are clearly both right wing individuals. Go choose a JFK. Go look at his speeches. Right. We will, we will defend freedom, or we defend democracy against any foe. We'll fight any battle, or even just space race. It's not one we are willing to postpone. Right. Is one we're willing to accept. There is that exceptionalism that and I always point this out, is like, there's a lot wrong with this country. I'm not someone that blindly thinks it's perfect. I think it is by far the least worst evil in the history of mankind. I think there's a lot wrong. I think we've done a lot of bad. There's been one too many civilian deaths. But if there's going to be a hegemon, if there's going to be a superpower, damn, I'd rather have it be us.
The goal is always before us to be better.
Yeah.
The founders didn't think we were perfect. No. They knew quite well that we were not.
Yeah.
But the point is to allow the freedom to the individual. And again, it's very important. We're not about identity groups. And
no.
We're not about left, right, black, white. We're about individualism.
Yes.
And that's what we were founded to support, was individualism. All of those. I mean, go back and just take a quick glance at John Locke's Second Treatise, or any of the books that inspired the founders. And they did. They're all about, before they wrote their own books, they're all about the idea that the individual is really the last repository of freedom. And that's how we keep government limited.
Yeah,
is by honoring that freedom.
I know we're going over. I got to wrap this one up because we both have appointments. Yeah. But give me 2 more minutes. And but there's one thing I've been thinking a lot about, is like, man, if there's one thing that Trump has done, I think of my, who love them dearly, but my super liberal friends who have just forever, screeching against guns, turn them into the government. Like, I owned a pistol in college, and you're evil. And I just think now, all these friends I have that have been doing marches for the last 4 years, we got to resist Trump, resist Hitler. I always just kind of like float the idea to him. I'm like, man, you should definitely buy some guns. Like, you don't want to be handing them over to Hitler in office, right? And there's just this subtle, like, you're right, we should own guns. I'm like, exactly.
It's interesting, just on that point, and then we can
we'll wrap this one up. Yeah.
Mahatma Gandhi, the ultimate man of peace.
Yeah.
Fighting for India's independence. One of his quotable quotes had to do with condemning the British for taking away the guns of the average Indians.
Yeah.
And you can find it. I mean, it's in the texts that are written about him, and it's fascinating because ultimately, the protection we have. That's why the Second Amendment was there, and they would never have gotten the Constitution passed were it not for those amendments being attached.
Absolutely.
So, anyway, I appreciate your promotion of the book, and Absolutely. Eagles and Evergreens is a very readable book.
It's very readable. It's very PG, by Robert Charles. It'll be in the description, the top comment, and the thumbnail, and they're all roughly separated vignettes, so it's not something you got to read down. You got to commit to it. You can grab a chapter and just come back to it the next week. Grab another chapter. Right. It's a very readable book, and it'll be in the description in the top comment. Very affordable, very readable, very PG, very friendly. Mr. Robert Charles, thank you so much, sir. And
thank you.
I will text you after this. We're going to do a third one because I enjoy talking to you.
Perfect. I appreciate everything you do. Keep at it.
Thank you, sir. You as well. America. God bless America. God bless everybody. Love each other. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
You too.
Bye-bye. Peace. Right.